Science has always been about openness. It's about sharing ideas with others. The only thing that open science really adds as a movement, if you wish, is to also open up more about the process that leads to that science, but also about the process as to what comes after the science has been conducted and published itself. So it's about not just opening up the final result of the scientific endeavor in the form of a publication, but it's also about openness in terms of the hypotheses that you are going to test or the ideas that you're following up on, the data that you are collecting, the code that you use to analyze that data, and all other aspects that involve making science more reproducible and more accessible to outsiders. And open science, in a nutshell, is not just to see as science as an end product, but also especially as a process that deserves to be opened up. It is probably a historical fact that management as a broader discipline has not always been at the forefront of open science. Other disciplines, such as, for example, psychology, have long surpassed us in that regard. But we're catching up very fast. One of the most tangible tokens of that is that our own PhD series has been open science, or open access at least, for at least 20 years. But in the future, RSM wants to make sure that it can buttress and also expand on its status as a leading research institute by also embracing open science as a process and as a movement even more. And that means opening up our principles of science and the studies that we do as much as possible to the widest possible audience. If you start venturing out on the path of open science, you have many options, right? You can pre-register your hypotheses in one platform. You can share the eventual product of your research on platforms such as SSRN or ResearchGate. You can put the code that you are programming into a platform such as GitHub, but still it would be a great idea to see whether the EDR, the Erasmus Data Repository, is not the platform that you might want to use and consider using for sharing your data with a wider audience. There's many great reasons for doing so. For one, it is the chosen platform of RSM. And that means that it is the place that people who are looking for data coming out of RSM will probably start their journey and their investigations. Another great idea is that you can essentially use the full flexibility of that program, whether you're using qualitative data, quantitative data, experimental data, or any other form of data that you are using. All of those data sources can find their own way onto the EDR, the Erasmus Data Repository. Finally, all the data sets, but also all kinds of ancillary materials or robustness checks that you have done can be posted there and will get their own DOI, Digital Object Identifier. And so that means that all of these data sets will be, for a very long time, if not for eternity, you'll be able to trace them there and to pinpoint them in terms of their accurate locations. And that makes it a great idea to start using EDR if you are indeed stepping out into the world of open science. So a question that we often get is whether all data indeed should be open and whether everything that you collect should be opened up to the wider public. This requires and this also demands a more nuanced answer. First of all, it's not just data that can be opened, right? I mean, oftentimes as scientists, we benefit the most from also sharing our research instruments, such as questionnaire items or programming code and other stuff. None of that is data in the pure sense of the word, but those things are worth sharing. So steps towards open science also involve opening up those specific types of content which are not necessarily data. That leaves us with the question, should we share all of our data? And there I would say no. But try to share as much as you possibly can. Obviously there are restrictions and we would like you to exercise your common sense, right? So privacy sensitive data probably should not be shared or only after consultation of your privacy officer. Other data may be restricted because of copyrights or license agreements, and it makes all the sense in the world to first check those prerequisites before you actually begin sharing and before you ask your data steward to actually start curating that data set. Having that said, in order to benefit as much as possible from the open science movement and to get your data as much out there as you possibly can, and also get the credits for all the hard research work that you have done, it makes an awful lot of sense to share as much as you can given the constraints that apply to it. Again, this requires a kind of nuanced answer. The simple part of it is that in a pecuniary sense, this is all free. the Erasmus University Rotterdam, as well as the Rotterdam School of Management itself, have graciously paid all the license costs, but also the personnel costs in terms of data curation involved with this entire and broader sense towards the open science movement. And the EDR, the Erasmus Data Repository, is also covered by funds from the Erasmus University Rotterdam itself. This leaves, of course, the question, how much of my time is this going to cost? And how much of my personal investment is this going to demand? Well, I'll be honest, right? I mean, the cost and the investments are non-trivial. It primarily changes a reinvention of and a change in your scientific routines. But the best way forward is not to really start by looking at all the projects that you have done in the past, but to start with a new project, right? So something that you are investigating right now, where you are at the beginning of the scientific journey, and then ask yourself the question, how can I open up from this point forward? And then you'll see that once you start designing projects with openness in mind, that the costs of each individual step are fairly trivial, and that at the end, the product by design is more open, more accessible, more traceable, and more citable than any of the projects that you've done in the past. And I assure you, once you start working this way, so moving forward towards greater openness, you'll never want to go back.